Hello, I shall now read to you from The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, written about 1505, published in 1515. And here we go. Chapter 1. How many kinds of principalities there are, and by what means they are acquired. All states, all powers that have held and hold rule over men have been and are either republics or principalities. Principalities are either hereditary, in which the family has long been established, or they are new. The new are entirely new, as was Milan to Francesco Sforza, or they are, as it were, members annexed to the hereditary state of the prince who has acquired them, as was the kingdom of Naples to that of the kingdom of Spain. Such dominions thus acquired are either accustomed to live under a prince or to live in freedom, and are acquired either by the arms of the prince himself or of others, or else by fortune or ability. Chapter 2. Concerning hereditary principalities. I will leave out all discussions on republics, inasmuch as in another place I have written of them at length, and will address myself only to principalities. In doing so, I will keep to the order indicated above and discuss how such principalities are to be ruled and preserved. I say at once there are fewer difficulties in holding hereditary states, and those long accustomed to the family of their prince, than new ones, for it is sufficient only not to transgress the customs of his ancestors, and to deal prudently with circumstances as they arise. For a prince of average powers to maintain himself in this state, unless he be deprived of it by some extraordinary and excessive force, and if he should be so deprived of it, whenever anything sinister happens, but to usurper, he will regain it. We have in Italy, for example, the Duke of Ferrara, who could not have withstood the attacks of the Venetians in 84, nor those of Pope Julius in 010, unless he had been long established in his dominions. For the hereditary prince has less cause and less necessity to offend. Hence it happens that he will be more loved, and unless extraordinary vices cause him to be hated, it is reasonable to expect that his subjects will be naturally well disposed towards him. And in the antiquity and duration of his rule, the memories and motives that make for change are lost, for one change always leaves the toothing for another. Chapter 3. Concerning mixed principalities. The difficulties occur in a new principality, and firstly, if it be not entirely new, but as it were a member of a state which, taken collectively, may be called composite, the changes arise chiefly from an inherent difficulty which there is in all new principalities. For men change their rules willingly, hoping to better themselves, and this hope induces them to take up arms against him who rules, wherein they are deceived, because they afterwards find by experience that they have gone from bad to worse. This follows also on another natural and common necessity, which always causes a new prince to burden those who have submitted to him with his soldiery, and with infinite other hardships which he must put upon his new acquisition. In this way, you have enemies in all those whom you have injured in seizing that principality, and you are not able to keep those friends who put you there because of your not being able to satisfy them in the way they expected. And you cannot take strong measures against them, feeling bound to them, for although one may be very strong in armed forces, yet in entering a province one has always need of the goodwill of the natives. For these reasons, Louis XII, King of France, quickly occupied Milan and just as quickly lost it. And to turn him out the first time, it only needed Ludovico's own forces, because those who had opened the gate to him, finding themselves deceived in their hopes of future benefit, would not endure the ill treatment of the new prince. It is very true that after acquiring rebellious provinces a second time, they are not so lost so lightly afterwards, because the prince, with little reluctance, takes the opportunity of the rebellion to punish the delinquents, to clear out the suspects, and to strengthen himself in the weakest suspects, in the weakest places, and to strengthen himself. Thus, to cause France to lose Milan the first time, it was enough for the Duke Ludovico to raise insurrections on the borders. But to cause him to lose it a second time, it was necessary to bring the whole world against him, and that his armies should be defeated and driven out of Italy, which followed from the causes above mentioned. Nevertheless, Milan was taken from France both the first and the second time. The general reasons for the first have been discussed. It remains to name those for the second, and to see what resources he had and what any in his situation would have had for maintaining himself more securely in his acquisition than did the King of France. Now I say that those whose dominions, which when acquired are added to an ancient state by him who acquires them, are either of the same country and language, or they are not. When they are of the same country and of the same language, it is easier to hold them, especially when they have not been accustomed to self-government. And to hold them securely, it is enough to have destroyed the family of the prince who was ruling them, because the two peoples, preserving in other things the old conditions, and not being unlike in customs, will live quietly together, as one has seen in Brittany, Burgundy, Gascony, and Normandy, which have been bound to France for so long a time, and although there may be some difference in language, nevertheless the customs are alike, and the people will easily be able to get on amongst themselves. He who has annexed them, if he wishes to hold them, has only to bear in mind two considerations. The one, that the family of their former lord is extinguished. Well, yes, of course. And the other, that neither their laws nor their taxes are altered, so that in a very short time they will become entirely one body with the old principality. But when states are acquired in a country, differing in language, customs, or laws, there are difficulties, and good fortune and great energy are needed to hold them. And one of the greatest and most helps would be that he who has required them should go and reside there. This would make his position more secure, and this would make his position more durable, as it has made that of the Turk in Greece, who, notwithstanding all the other measures taken by him for holding that state, if he had not settled there, would not have been able to keep it, because if one is on the spot, disorders are seen as they spring up, and one can quickly remedy them. But if one is not at hand, they heard only of when they are, one can no longer remedy them. Besides this, the country is not pillaged by your officials. The subjects are satisfied by prompt recourse to the prince. Thus, wishing to be good, they have more cause to love him, and wishing to be otherwise, to fear him. He who would attack that state from the outside must have the utmost caution. As long as a prince resides there, it can only be wrested from him with the greatest difficulty. The other and better course is to send colonies to one or two places, which may be as keys to that state. For it is necessary either to do this, or else to keep there a great number of cavalry and infantry. A prince does not spend much on colonies, for with little or no expense he can send them out and keep them there, and he offends a minority only of the citizens from whom he takes lands and houses to give them to the new inhabitants. And those whom he offends, remaining poor and scattered, are never able to injure him, whilst the rest, being uninjured, are easily kept quiet, and at the same time are anxious not to err, for fear it should happen to them, as it has happened to those who have been despoiled. In conclusion, I say that these colonies are not costly. They are more faithful, they injure less, and the injured, as has been said, being poor and scattered, cannot hurt. Upon this, one has to remark that men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves. Yes, indeed, they can avenge themselves of the lighter injuries. Of more serious injuries, they cannot. Therefore, the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. But in maintaining armed men there in place of colonies, one spends much more, having to consume on the garrison all income from the state, so that the acquisition turns into a loss, and many more are exasperated, because the whole state is injured. Through the shifting of the garrison up and down, all become acquainted with hardship, and all become hostile, and they are enemies, who, whilst beaten on their own ground, are yet able to do hurt. For every reason, therefore, such guards are as useless as a colony is useful. Again, the prince who holds a country differing in the above aspects ought to make himself the head and defender of his powerful neighbors, and to weaken the more powerful amongst them, taking care that no foreigner as powerful as himself shall by any accident get a footing there. For it will always happen that such a one will be introduced by those who are discontented, either through excessive affirmation or through fear, as one has seen already. The Romans were brought into Greece by the Aetolians, and in every other country where they obtained a footing, they were brought in by the inhabitants. And the usual course of affairs is that as soon as a powerful foreigner enters a country, all the subject states are drawn to him, moved by the hatred which they feel against him and the ruling power. So that in respect to these subjects, come now. So that, okay, here we go. So that in respect to these subjects states, he has not to take any trouble to gain them over to himself, for the whole of them quickly rally to the state which he has acquired there. He has only to take care that they do not get hold of too much power and too much authority, and then with his own forces and with their goodwill, he can easily keep down the more powerful of them. So, as to remain entirely master in that country, he must do so. And as he who does not properly manage this business will soon lose what he has acquired. And whilst he does hold it, he will have endless difficulties and troubles. The Romans, in the countries which they annexed, observed closely these measures. They sent colonies and maintained friendly relations with the minor powers, without increasing their strength. They kept down the greater and did not allow any strong foreign powers to gain authority. Greece appears sufficient for an example. The Achaeans and Aetolians were kept friendly by them. The kingdom of Macedonia was humbled. Antiochus was driven out, yet the merits of the Achaeans and Aetolians never secured for them permission to increase their power, nor did the persuasions of Philip ever induce the Romans to be his friends without first humbling him. Nor did the influence of Antiochus make them agree that he should retain any lordship over the country, because the Romans did in these instances what all prudent princes ought to do, who have to regard not only present troubles, but also future ones, for which they must prepare with every energy, because when foreseen, it is easy to remedy them. But if you wait until they approach, the medicine is no longer in time, because the malady has become incurable. For it happens in this, as the physicians say it happens in hectic fever, that in the beginning of the malady it is easy to cure, but difficult to detect. but in the course of time, not having been either detected or treated in the beginning, it becomes easy to detect, but difficult to cure. Thus it happens in affairs of state, for when the evils that arise have been foreseen, which it is only given to a wise man to see, they can quickly be redressed. But when through not having been foreseen, they have been permitted to grow in a way that everyone can see them, then there is no longer a remedy. Therefore the Romans, foreseeing troubles, dealt with them at once, and even to avoid a war, would not let them come to a head, for they knew that war is not to be avoided, but is only put off to the advantage of others. Moreover, they wished to fight with Philip and Antiochus in Greece so as not to have to do it in Italy. They could have avoided both, but this they did not wish, nor did that ever please them, which is forever in the mouths of the wise ones of our time. Let us enjoy the benefits of the time, but rather the benefits of their own valor and prudence, for time drives everything before it, and is able to bring with it good as well as evil, and evil as well as good. Part 2. Let us turn to France and inquire whether she has done any of the things mentioned. I will speak of Louis XII and not of Charles VIII as the one whose conduct is the better to be observed, he having held possessions of Italy for the longest period, and you will see that he has done the opposite to those things which ought to have been done to retain a state composed of diverse elements. King Louis was brought into Italy by the ambition of the Venetians, who desired to obtain half the state of Lombardy by his intervention. I will not blame the course taken by the king, because wishing to get a foothold in Italy, and having no friends there, seeing rather that every door was shut to him owing to the conduct of Charles, he was forced to accept those friendships which he could get, and he would have succeeded very quickly in his design if in other matters he had not made some mistakes. The king, however, having acquired Lombardy, regarded at once the authority which Charles had lost. Genoa yielded. The Florentines became his friends. The Marquess of Mantua, the Duke of Ferrara, the Bentivoglio of Mantua, the Duke of Ferrara, the Lords of Faenza, of Pesaro, of Rimini, of Camerino, of Piombino, the Lucchesi, the Pisans, and the Sienese, everybody made advances to him to become his friend. Then could the Venetians realize the rashness of the course taken by them, which in order that they might secure 2 towns in Lombardy, had made the king master of 2/3 of Italy, which was very foolish. Let anyone now consider with what little difficulty the king could have maintained his position in Italy, had he observed the rules above laid down, and kept all his friends secure and protected. For although they were numerous, they were both weak and timid, some afraid of the church, some of the Venetians. And thus they would always have been forced to stand in with him, and by these means he could easily have made himself secure against those who remained powerful. But he was no sooner in Milan than he did the contrary by assisting Pope Alexander to occupy the Romagna. It never occurred to him, that by this action he was weakening himself, depriving himself of friends and those who had thrown themselves into his lap, whilst he aggrandized the church by adding much temporal power to the spiritual, thus giving it greater authority. And having committed this prime error, he was obliged to follow it up, so much so that to put an end to the ambition of Alexander and to prevent his becoming the master of Tuscany, he was himself forced to come into Italy. And as if it were not enough to have aggrandized the church and deprived himself friends, he, wishing to have the kingdom of Naples, divides it with the king of Spain. And where he was the prime arbiter of Italy, he takes an associate, so that the ambitious and ambitions of that country and the malcontents of his own should have where to shelter, and whereas he could have left in the kingdom his own pensioner as king, he drove him out to put one there who was able to drive him, Louis, out in turn. Very foolish. The wish to acquire, in truth, very natural and common, and men always do so when they can, and for this they will be praised, not blamed. But when they cannot do so, yet wish to do so, by any means, then there is folly and blame. Therefore, if France could have attacked Naples with her own forces, she ought to have done so. If she could not, then she ought not to have divided it. And if the partition was justified by the excuse that by it she got a foothold in Italy, this other partition merited blame, for it had not the excuse of that necessity. Therefore, Louis made these 5 errors. He destroyed the minor powers. He increased the strength of one of the greater powers in Italy. He brought in a foreign power. He did not settle in the country, and he did not send colonies, which errors, if he had lived, were not enough to injure him, had he not made a 6th error by taking away their dominions from the Venetians. Because, had he not aggrandized the church, nor brought Spain into Italy, it would have been very reasonable and necessary to humble them. But having first taken these steps, he ought never to have consented to their ruin, for they, being powerful, would always have kept off others from designs on Lombardy, to which the Venetians would never have consented except to become masters themselves there. Also, because the others would not wish to take Lombardy from France in order to give it to the Venetians, and to run counter to both, they would not have had the courage. And if anyone should say King Louis yielded the Romagna to Alexander, and the kingdom to Spain to avoid war, well, I answer for the reasons given above, that a blunder ought never be perpetrated to avoid war, because it is not to be avoided, but is only deferred to disadvantage. And if another should allege the pledge which the king had given to the Pope, that he would assist him in his enterprise in exchange for the dissolution of his marriage and for the hat to Rouen, to that I reply what I shall write later on concerning the fact of princes and how it ought to be kept. Thus, King Louis lost Lombardy by not having followed any of the conditions observed by those who have taken possession of countries and wished to retain them. Nor is there any miracle in this, but much that is reasonable and quite natural. And on these matters I spoke at Nantes with Rouen when Valentino, as Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander was usually called, occupied the Romagna. And on Cardinal Rouen, observing to me that the Italians did not understand war, I replied to him that the French did not understand statecraft, meaning that otherwise they would not have allowed the church to reach such greatness. And in fact, it has been seen that the greatness of the church and of Spain in Italy has been caused by France, and her ruin may be attributed to them. From this a general rule is drawn, which never or rarely fails, that he who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined, because that predominancy has been brought about either by astuteness or else by force, and both are distrusted by him who has been raised to power. So think about that. Okay, chapter 4. Why the kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander, did not rebel against the successors of Alexander at his death. And you must remember that all of these precepts in this book, which was written in the 16th century, are apt and apropos today to our present reality, because these are the basic principles of statecraft and should well be studied by everyone today. And that is why I'm reading this to you. I shall have a nice cup of tea. So, back we go with chapter 4, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. Oh, and I will say this. This was never meant to be read. This was a letter. This was published many years after Machiavelli's death. And had it been published when he was alive, he most probably would have been executed. Because it's pretty powerful stuff. Very cynical, but he is telling the truth on how to gain power and maintain powers. Okay, so like I said, chapter 4, why the kingdom of Darius, or however you wish to pronounce it, conquered by Alexander the Great of Macedon, did not rebel against the successors of Alexander at his death, which he probably could have done, since there was a cult of personality and Alexander was the one who got it all going. Okay, consider the difficulties which men have had to hold a newly acquired state. Some might wonder how, seeing that Alexander the Great became the master of Asia in a very few years and died while it was yet scarcely settled, whence it might appear reasonable that the whole empire should have rebelled. Nevertheless, his successors maintained themselves and had to meet no other difficulty than that which arose among themselves from their own ambitions. I answer that the principalities of which one has record are found to be governed in two different ways, either by a prince with a body of servants who assist him to govern the kingdom as ministers by his favor and permission, or by a prince and barons who hold that dignity by antiquity of blood and not by the grace of the prince. That's very important. Such barons have states and their own subjects who recognize them as lords and hold them in natural affection. These states that are governed by a prince and his servants hold their prince in mere consideration, because in all the country there is no one who is recognized as superior to him. And if they yield obedience to another, they do it as to a minister and official, and they do not bear him any particular affection. The examples of these two governments in our time are the Turk and the King of France. The entire monarchy of the Turk is governed by one lord. The others are his servants, and dividing his kingdom into sanjaks, he sends their different administrators and shifts and changes them as he chooses. But the King of France is placed in the midst of an ancient body of lords, acknowledged by their own subjects and beloved by them. They have their own prerogatives, nor can the king take them away except at his peril. Therefore, he who considers both of these states will recognize great difficulties in seizing the state of the Turk, but once it is conquered, great ease in holding it. The causes of the difficulties in seizing the kingdom of the Turk are that the usurper cannot be called in by the princes of the kingdom, nor can he hope to be assisted in his designs by the revolt of those whom the Lord has around him. This arises from the reasons given above, for his ministers, being all slaves and bondsmen, can only be corrupted with great difficulty, and one can expect little advantage from them when they have been corrupted, as they cannot carry the people with them for the reasons assigned. Hence, he who attacks the Turks must bear in mind that he will find him united, and he will have to rely more on his own strength than on the revolt of others. But if once the Turk has been conquered and routed in the field in such a way that he cannot replace his armies, there is nothing to fear but the family of the prince. And this being exterminated, there remains no one to fear at all, the others having no credit with the people, and as the conqueror did not rely on them before his victory, so he ought not to fear them after it. The contrary happens in kingdoms governed like that of France, because one can easily enter there by gaining over some barons of the kingdom. For one always finds malcontents, and such as desire a change. Such men, for the reasons given, can open the way into the state and render the victor easy. But if you wish to hold it afterwards, you meet with infinite difficulties, both from those who have assisted you and from those you have crushed. Nor is it enough for you to have exterminated the family of the prince, because the lords that remain make themselves the heads of fresh movements against you. And as you are unable either to satisfy or exterminate them, that state is lost whenever time brings the opportunity. Now, if you will consider what was the nature of the government of Darius, you will find it similar to the kingdom of the Turk. And therefore it was only necessary for Alexander first to overthrow him in the field, and then to take the country from him. After which victory, Darius being killed, the states remained secure to Alexander for the above reasons. And if his successors had been united, they would have enjoyed it securely and at their ease. For there are and were no tumults raised in the kingdom, because the people were used to being dominated, except those that they provoked themselves. But it is impossible to hold with such tranquility states constituted like that of France. Hence arose those frequent rebellions against the Romans in Spain, France, and Greece, owing to the many principalities there were in those states, of which as long as their memory of them endured, the Romans always held an insecure possession. But with the power and long continuance of the empire, the memory of them passed away, and the Romans then became secure possessors. And when fighting afterwards amongst themselves, each one was able to attach to himself his own parts of the country, according to the authority he had assumed there. And the family of the former lord being exterminated, none other than the Romans were acknowledged. When these things are remembered, no one will marvel at the ease with which Alexander held the empire of Asia, or at the difficulties which others have had to keep an acquisition, such as Pyrrhus and many more. This is not occasioned by the little or abundance of ability in the conqueror, but by the want of uniformity in the subject state. So, and we proceed onward to chapter 5, concerning the way to govern cities or principalities which lived under their own laws before they were annexed, which would be, so to speak, independent states. Whenever these states which have been acquired, as stated, have been accustomed to live under their own laws and in freedom, such as the United States, there are three courses for those who wish to hold them. The first is to ruin them, devastate them. The next is to reside there in person. The third is to permit them to live under their own laws, drawing a tribute and establishing within it an oligarchy, which will keep it friendly to you. Because such a government being created by the prince knows that it cannot stand without his friendship and interest, and does its utmost to support him. And therefore he who would keep a city accustomed to freedom will hold it more easily by the means of its own citizens than in any other way. There are, for example, the Spartans and the Romans. The Spartans held Athens and Thebes, establishing there an oligarchy. Nevertheless, they lost them. The Romans, in order to hold Capua, Carthage, and Numantia, dismantled them and did not lose them. They wished to hold Greece as the Spartans held it, making it free and permitted its laws, and did not succeed. So to hold it, they were compelled to dismantle many cities in the country. For in truth, there is no safe way to retain them otherwise than by ruining them. And he who becomes master of a city, accustomed to freedom, and does not destroy it, may expect to be destroyed by it, for in rebellion it always has the watchword of liberty and its ancient privileges as a rallying point, which neither time nor benefits will ever cease to forget. And whatever you may do or provide against, they never forget that name or their privilege unless they are disunited or dispersed, but at every chance they immediately rally to them, as Pisa after the 100 years as she had been held in bondage by the Florentines. But when the cities or countries are accustomed to live under a prince and his family is exterminated, they, being on the one hand accustomed to obey and on the other hand not having the old prince, cannot agree in making one from amongst themselves, and they do not know how to govern themselves. For this reason, they are very slow to take up arms, and a prince can gain them to himself and secure them much more easily. But in republics, there is more vitality, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance, which will never permit them to allow the memory of their former liberty to rest, so that the safest way to destroy them is to ruin and annihilate them, or to reside there. So, do you see what he's saying here? He's saying that a country who has used to freedom and has been free is much more difficult to conquer than a country who has served under a despotic or all-ruling ruler, because they don't know how to govern themselves. And this is very good advice that Machiavelli is giving here, and it's very relative to our situation today. Okay, chapter 6, concerning new principalities which are acquired by one's own arms and ability. Let no one be surprised if, in speaking of entirely new principalities, as I shall do, I adduce the highest examples both of prince and of state, because men walking almost always in paths beaten by others, and following by imitation their deeds, are yet unable to keep entirely to the ways of others, or attain to the power of those they imitate. A wise man ought always to follow the paths beaten by great men, and to imitate those who have been supreme, so that if his ability does not equal theirs, at least it will savor of it. Let him act like the clever archers who, designing to hit the mark which yet appears too far distant, and knowing the limits to which the strength of the bow attains, take aim much higher than the mark, not to reach by their strength or arrow to so great a height, but to be able with the aid of so high an aim to hit the mark they wish to reach. I say, therefore, that in an entirely new principalities where there is a new prince, more or less difficulty is found in keeping them, accordingly as there are more or less ability in him who has acquired the state. Now, as the fact of becoming a prince from a private station presupposes either ability or fortune, it is clear that one or the other of these two things will mitigate in some degree many difficulties. Nevertheless, he who has relied least on fortune is established the strongest. Therefore, further, it facilitates matters when the prince, having no other state, is compelled to reside there in person. But to come to those who by their own ability and not through fortune have risen to be princes, I say that Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and such like are the most examples of excellence. And although one may not discuss Moses, he having been a mere executor of the will of God, yet he ought to be admired, if only for that favor which made him worthy to speak with God. But in considering Cyrus and others who have acquired or founded kingdoms, all will be found admirable. And if their particular deeds and conduct shall be considered, they will not be found inferior to those of Moses, although he had so great a preceptor. And in examining their actions and lives, one cannot see that they owed anything to fortune beyond opportunity, which brought them the material to mold into the form which seems best to them. Without that opportunity, their powers of mind would have been extinguished, and without those powers, the opportunity would have come in vain. It was necessary, therefore, to Moses that he should find the people of Israel in Egypt enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians, in order that they should be disposed to follow him so as to be delivered out of bondage. It was necessary that Romulus should not remain in Alba, and that he should be abandoned at his birth, in order that he should become king of Rome and founder of the fatherland. In other words, had these people been living in luxury and had been satisfied with their lot, they never would have been willing to make a move, to change their situation. It was necessary that Cyrus should find, come on thing. Come back here. Alright, hold on. Boop. That Cyrus should find... Oh my goodness, I lost my place. Y'all have to forgive me. Give me a moment. I'll find it. Okay, where'd it go? Okay. It was necessary that Cyrus should find the Persians discontented with the government of the Medes, and the Medes to be soft and effeminate through their long peace. Theseus could not have shown his ability had he not found the Athenians dispersed. These opportunities, therefore, made these men fortunate, and their high ability enabled them to recognize the opportunity whereby their country was ennobled and made famous. In other words, the people whom they rescued or conquered were weak and had fallen into a life of sybaritic luxury and forgotten their arts of war, which made them great. But those who by valorous ways became princes, like these men, acquire principality with difficulty, but they keep it with ease. The difficulties they have in acquiring it arise in part from the new rules and methods which they are forced to introduce to establish their government and its security. And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because people like things to which they are used. People are afraid of new things. If it's not broken, don't fix it, and so forth and whatnot. So, the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, see, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from the fear of the opponents who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them, which is the worst form of reactionarianism, is to be afraid to take a chance, and to be afraid to try out new things, and by doing so you cut yourself off. So it happens that whenever those who are hostile have the opportunity to attack, they do it like partisans, while the others defend lukewarmly in such wise that the prince is endangered along with them. It is necessary, therefore, if we desire to discuss these matters thoroughly, to inquire whether these innovators can rely on themselves or have to, or have to depend on others, that is to say, whether to consummate their enterprise, have they to use prayers or can they use force? In the first instance, they always succeed badly and never compass anything. But when they can rely on themselves and use force, then they are rarely endangered. Hence it is that all armed prophets have conquered, and the unarmed prophets have been destroyed. Besides, the reasons mentioned, the nature of the people is variable, and while it's easy to persuade them, it is difficult to fix them in that persuasion. And thus it is necessary to take such measures that when they believe no longer, it may be possible to make them believe by force. If Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus had been unarmed, they could not have enforced their constitutions for long. As has happened in our time to Fra Girolamo Savonarola, who was ruined with his new order of things, immediately the multitude believed in him no longer, and he had no means of keeping steadfast those who believed, or of making the unbelievers to believe. Therefore, such as these have great difficulties in consummating their enterprise, for all their dangers are in the ascent, yet with ability they will overcome them. But when they are overcome, and those who envied them their successes are exterminated, they will begin to be respected, and they will continue afterwards powerful, secure, honored, and happy. To these great examples I wish to add a lesser one. Still it bears some semblance to them, and I wish it to suffice me for all of a like kind. It is Hiero the Syracusan. This man rose from a private station to be Prince of Syracuse, nor did he either owe anything to fortune but opportunity, for the Syracusans, being oppressed, chose him for their captain. Afterwards, he was rewarded by being made their prince. He was of no great ability, even as a private citizen, but one who writes of him says he wanted nothing but a kingdom to be a king. This man abolished the old soldiery, organized the new, gave up old alliances, made new ones, and as he had his own soldiers and allies, on such foundations he was able to build any edifice. Thus, whilst he had endured much trouble in acquiring, he had but little trouble in keeping. So, And chapter 7, concerning new principalities, which are acquired either by the arms of others or by good fortune. Those who solely by good fortune become princes from being private citizens have little trouble in rising, but much in keeping the top. They have not any difficulties on the way up, because they fly, but they have many when they reach the summit. Such are those to whom some state is given either for money or by the favor of him who bestows it, as happened to many in Greece, in the cities of Ionia and the Hellespont, where princes were made by Darius, in order that they might hold the cities both for his security and his glory, as also were those emperors who by the corruption of the soldiers from being citizens came to empire. Such stand simply upon the goodwill and the fortune of him who has elevated them, two most inconsistent and unstable things. Neither have they the knowledge requisite for their position, because unless they are men of great worth and ability, it is not reasonable to expect that they should know how to command. Having always lived in private conditions, besides, they cannot hold it because they have not forces which can be kept friendly and faithful. States that rise unexpectedly, then, like all other things in a nature which are born and grow rapidly, cannot have their foundations and relations with other states fixed in such a way that the first storm will not overthrow them, unless, as is said, those who unexpectedly become princes are men of so much ability that they know they have to be prepared at once to hold that which fortune has thrown into their laps, and that those foundations which others have laid before them, and before they became princes, they must lay afterwards. Concerning these two methods of rising to be a prince by ability or fortune, I wish to adduce two examples within our own recollection, and these are Francisco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. Francisco, by proper means and with great ability from being a private person, arose to be Duke of Milan, and that which he had acquired with 1,000 anxieties kept with little trouble. On the other hand, Cesare Borgia, called by the people Duke Valentino, acquired his state during the ascendancy of his father, and on its decline he lost it, notwithstanding that he had taken every measure and done all that ought to be done by a wise and able man to fix firmly his roots in the states, which the arms of fortune of others had bestowed on him. See, because as is stated above, he has not first laid his foundations, may be able with great ability to lay them afterwards, but they will be laid with trouble to the architect and danger to the building. If therefore all the steps taken by the Duke be considered, it will be seen that he laid solid foundations for his future power, and I do not consider it superfluous to discuss them, because I do not know what better precepts to give a new prince than the example of his actions. And if his dispositions were of no avail, that was not his fault, but the extraordinary and extreme malignity of fortune. Alexander VI, in wishing to aggrandize the Duke, his son, Cesare, had many immediate and prospective difficulties. First, he did not see his way to make him master of any state that was not a state of the church. And if he was willing to rob the church, he knew that the Duke of Milan and the Venetians would not consent, because Firenze and Rimini were already under the protection of the Venetians. See. Besides this, he saw the arms of Italy, especially those by which he might have been assisted, in hands that would fear the aggrandizement of the Pope, namely the Orsini and the Colonna and their following. It behooved him, therefore, to upset the state of affairs and embroil the powers so as to make himself securely master of part of their states. This was easy for him to do because he found the Venetians, moved by other reasons, inclined to bring back the French into Italy. He would not only not oppose this, but he would render it more easy by dissolving the former marriages of King Louis. Therefore the king came into Italy with the assistance of the Venetians and the consent of Alexander. He was no sooner in Milan than the Pope had soldiers from him for the attempt on the Romagna, which yielded to him on the reputation of the king. The Duke, therefore, having acquired the Romagna and beaten the Colonna, which wishing to hold that and to advance further, was hindered by two things. The one, his forces did not appear loyal to him, and the other, goodwill of France. That is to say, he feared that the forces of the Orsini, which was using, would not stand to him. That not only might they hinder him from winning more, but might themselves seize what he had won, and that the king might also do the same. Of the Orsini, he had a warning when, after taking Faenza and attacking Bologna, he saw them go very unwillingly to that attack. And as to the king, he learned his mind when he himself, after taking the Duchy of Urbino, attacked Tuscany, and the king made him desist from that undertaking. Hence the Duke decided to depend no more upon the arms and the luck of others. For the first thing, he weakened the Orsini and Colonna parties in Rome by gaining to himself all their adherents who were gentlemen, making them his gentlemen, giving them good pay and according to their rank, honoring them with office and command in such a way that in a few months all attachments to the factions were destroyed and turned entirely to the Duke. After this, he awaited an opportunity to crush the Orsini, having scattered the adherents of the Colonna. This came to him soon, and he used it well, for the Orsini, perceiving at length that the aggrandizement of the Duke and the church was ruin to them. So they called a meeting at Magione in the territory of Perugia, and from this aspiring union sprang the rebellion at Urbino and the tumults in the Romagna, with endless dangers to the Duke, all of which he overcame with the help of the French. Having restored his authority, not to leave it at risk by trusting it to the French or other outside forces, he had recourse to his wiles. And he knew so well how to conceal his mind, that by the meditation and the mediation of Signor Paolo Orsini, whom the Duke did not fail to secure with all kinds of attention, giving him money, apparel, and horses, the Orsini were reconciled so that their simplicity brought them into his power at Senigallia. Having exterminated the leaders and turned their partisans into his friends, the Duke had laid sufficiently good foundations to his power, having all the Romagna and the Duchy of Urbino, and the people now beginning to appreciate their prosperity. He gained them all over to himself. And at this point, it is worthy to notice, and to be imitated by others. I am not willing to leave it out. When the Duke occupied the Romagna, he found it under the rule of weak masters, who rather plundered their subjects than ruled them, and gave them more cause for disunion than for union, so that the country was full of robbery, quarrels, and every kind of violence. And so, wishing to bring back peace and obedience to authority, he considered it necessary to give it a good governor. Thereupon he promoted Messer Ramiro de Lorca, a swift and cruel man, to whom he gave the fullest powers. This man in a short time restored peace and unity with the greatest success. Afterwards the Duke considered that it was not available or advisable to confer such excessive authority, for he had no doubt that he would become odious. So he set up a court of judgment in the country under a most excellent president, wherein all cities had their advocates. And because he knew that the past severity had caused some hatred against himself, so, to clear himself in the minds of the people and gain them entirely to himself, he desired to show that if any cruelty had been practiced, it had not originated with him, but in the natural sternness of the minister. Under this pretense, he took Ramiro and one morning caused him to be executed and left on the piazza at Cesena with the block and a bloody knife at his side. The barbarity of the spectacle caused the people to be at once satisfied and dismayed. But let us return whence we started. I say that the Duke, finding himself now sufficiently powerful and partly secured from immediate dangers by having armed himself in his own way, and having in a great measure crushed those forces in his vicinity that could injure him, if he wished to proceed with his conquest, had next to consider France. For he knew that the king, who too late was aware of his mistake, would not support him. And from this time he began to seek new alliances, and to temporize with France in the expedition which she was making towards the kingdom of Naples against the Spaniards who were besieging Gaeta. It was his intent to secure himself against them, and thus he would have quickly accomplished had Alexander lived. Such was his line of action as to prevent affairs, but as to the future he had to fear, in the first place, that a new successor to the church might not be friendly to him, and might seek to take from him that which Alexander had given him. So he decided to act in 4 ways. First, he exterminated the families of those lords whom he had despoiled, so as to take away that pretext from the Pope. Secondly, by winning to himself all the gentlemen of Rome so as to be able to curb the Pope with their aid, as has been observed. Thirdly, by converting the college more to himself. Fourthly, by acquiring so much power before the Pope should before the Pope should die, that he could by his own measures resist the first shock. Of these 4 things, at the death of Alexander, he had accomplished 3, for he had killed as many of the dispossessed lords. What a guy. He had pardon me. He had killed as many of the dispossessed lords as he could lay hands on, and few had escaped. He had won over the Roman gentlemen, and he had the most numerous party in the college. And as to any fresh acquisitions, he intended to become master of Tuscany, for he already possessed Perugia, and Piombino, and Pisa was also under his protection. And as he had no longer to study France, for the French were already driven out of the kingdom of Naples by the Spaniards, yes, and so I believe that we shall take a break there, for that is quite enough for right now, and I shall continue at a later date. And I thank you very much for your consideration, and rock on!